The final passenger. It was a cold, rainy night when Daniel Alvarez, a seasoned taxi driver, began his last shift before heading home. The city streets were empty, the neon lights of the stores reflecting in the puddles that formed on the cracked pavement. It had been a slow night, just a few scattered passengers heading home from late-night bars or overtime shifts. Daniel sighed, checking the clock on his dashboard. 1:45 a.m. Just 15 more minutes, and he could call it a night. But then, as he turned onto a dimly lit street, he saw her. A lone woman stood by the side of the road, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders, wearing a long flowing dress that seemed strangely out of place. For the weather? Her arms were wrapped around herself as if she were freezing, yet she wasn't wet despite the rain that had been falling for hours. Daniel slowed down and rolled down his window. "Need a ride?" he asked. The woman nodded silently and stepped into the back seat. Her presence sent an odd chill through the air, making Daniel shiver despite the car's heater running. He glanced at her through the rearview mirror. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes were cast downward as if lost in deep thought. "Where to?" he asked, trying to shake off the unease creeping up his spine. She spoke in a soft, almost whisper-like tone. "Ravenswood Drive." Yuzon-Iki Daniel frowned. He knew that area. It had been abandoned for years after a massive fire had destroyed several houses. No one lived there anymore. "Are you sure?" he asked, hesitating. "That neighborhood is—" "I need to go home," she interrupted, her voice calm but firm. Daniel felt a strange compulsion to listen. Against his better judgment, he put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. A silent ride. The journey through the city was eerily quiet. Unlike most passengers, the woman didn't engage in small talk or check her phone. She simply stared out the window as the streetlights flickered past. Daniel stole glances at her in the mirror, noticing how her expression never changed. Distant, melancholy, as though she carried a sorrow too heavy for words. The rain grew heavier, and the city soon faded into darkness as they entered the outskirts. The road leading to Ravenswood Drive was long and desolate, lined with twisted trees that cast eerie shadows in the dim glow of his headlights. Finally, the car pulled up in front of 112 Ravenswood Drive, or at least what was left of it. The house that shouldn't be. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He had expected to find a burned-down ruin, overgrown with weeds and forgotten by time. But instead the house stood completely intact, as though it had never been touched by fire at all. A two-story Victorian home. Its white walls gleamed under the pale moonlight. The porch light was on, flickering slightly, and the windows were lit with a warm golden glow, as if inviting someone inside. Daniel turned in his seat to look at the woman. "Are you sure this is—" But his words died in his throat. The back seat was empty. His heart pounded violently. He hadn't heard the door open. He hadn't felt the car shift as someone exited. He had just spoken to her, and now she was gone. A cold dread settled in his stomach. Shaking, he turned back to the house. And that's when he saw her. She was standing on the porch, her long dress swaying gently in the wind. This time, her face was visible. Illuminated by the glow of the lantern, her eyes met his. A single tear rolled down her cheek. Then, As Daniel watched in horror, she vanished. The lights inside the house flickered violently, then went out altogether, plunging the entire street into darkness. Daniel's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his breathing ragged. He had driven passengers for over a decade, but nothing, not drunks, not fights, not even late-night chases, had ever filled him with the sheer terror he felt now. He had just given a ride to a ghost. The truth behind 112. Ravenswood Drive, desperate for answers, Daniel sped away from the abandoned street and headed straight to the nearest police station. When he arrived, he burst through the doors, his pulse racing. A tired officer at the front desk looked up, startled. "Can I help you?" "There was a woman," Daniel stammered. "I picked her up in my taxi. She asked me to take her to 112 Ravenswood Drive. But when we got there, she just vanished." The officer's face paled. He exchanged a glance with a colleague before speaking carefully. "What did she look like?" Daniel described her. The pale skin, the long dark hair, the sorrowful expression. The officer's face turned grim. "That house burned down 10 years ago," he said quietly. The only victim was a young woman named Evelyn Carter. She had been waiting for her fiancé to pick her up that night, but he never arrived. She was alone when the fire started. Daniel felt his blood run cold. But the house, it was still there. The lights were on. She walked up the steps. The officer shook his head. "That house hasn't existed for a decade. There's nothing but an empty lot now." A deep silence filled the room. Finally, the officer sighed. "You're not the first to see her." Daniel's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" "Every few years, a taxi driver comes in telling the same story. A woman gets in their car, asks to go home, and then disappears when they arrive, always at 112 Ravenswood Drive." Daniel swallowed hard. "Why does she keep coming back?" The officer's eyes were filled with something between pity and fear. "She's still waiting, still trying to get home." Daniel sat in stunned silence, his mind reeling. The woman, the ghost, had sat in his car. She had spoken to him. She had been real. And yet she had been gone for 10 years, a final farewell. For weeks, Daniel couldn't shake the memory of the encounter. He stopped taking night shifts. He stopped driving past Ravenswood Drive altogether. But something inside him felt unfinished. One evening just before sunset, he drove back to the lot where the house once stood. He stepped out of his car, clutching a small bouquet of white lilies, flowers for lost souls. As he approached the empty lot, a soft breeze stirred around him. The air felt heavy, charged with an unseen presence. "I hope you find your way home," he whispered, placing the flowers where the doorstep had once been. For a brief moment he felt warmth, not the cold he had felt that night, but something soft and comforting, like a farewell. Then just as quickly as it came, it was gone, and Daniel knew. Evelyn Carter had finally found